At exactly 4:17 in the morning, Dr. Marcus Thompson's hands began to tremble as he performed what should have been a routine bandage change. The patient had been comatose for 18 months, brain dead, according to her family, a lost cause, according to his colleagues. But as Marcus gently lifted the gauze from Catherine Vanderberg's arm, her eyes suddenly snapped open. Her grip on his wrist was impossibly strong for someone who hadn't moved in over a year. Her voice, when it came, was crystal clear and terrifyingly calm. "I know what they've been planning, Marcus. I've heard every word." What happened next would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Atlanta's medical elite, destroy careers built on decades of privilege, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone believes is powerless. What would you do if the person who held your future in their hands had been watching you all along? Dr. Marcus Thompson pulls his Honda Civic into the staff parking lot of Piedmont Mercy Hospital at 5:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before his shift begins. At 32, he carries himself with the quiet dignity of someone who has learned to make himself small in spaces that weren't designed for him. His close-cropped hair is always neatly trimmed, maintained at the barber shop in East Atlanta where his grandmother used to take him as a child. His scrubs are always perfectly pressed despite being the generic brand from the hospital gift shop, not the designer medical wear his colleagues favor. The fabric is soft from countless washings, worn thin at the elbows and knees, but spotlessly clean. Around his neck, he wears a small silver chain that catches the fluorescent lights of the hospital corridors. It's the only jewelry he allows himself, a gift from his grandmother who raised him in the Thomasville Heights projects of East Atlanta. The chain holds a small pendant containing 2 photographs, one of his grandmother in a crisp white nurse's uniform from 1962, and hidden beneath it, a yellowed newspaper clipping showing a 17-year-old Marcus receiving a full scholarship to medical school. The headline reads, "East Atlanta boy earns full ride to study medicine." The scholarship was funded by the Vanderberg Foundation, though Marcus tells himself that's just a coincidence. Marcus's colleagues barely acknowledge his presence as he enters the intensive care unit. To Dr. Harrison Webb, the department head with his silver hair and Harvard pedigree, he's just another diversity hire who somehow made it through the cracks of affirmative action. To the nurses with their 20 years of experience and their unspoken hierarchies, he's an outsider who doesn't understand how things work in their world. They see his gentle touch with patients as weakness, his careful attention to detail as inexperience, his willingness to take difficult cases as naivety. What they don't see is the brilliance behind his dark eyes, the way he can diagnose conditions that stump attending physicians with decades more experience, or how patients respond to his care in ways that defy medical explanation. They don't know that he graduated summa cum laude from Emory University School of Medicine, that he turned down opportunities at Johns Hopkins and Harvard to stay close to his community, or that he volunteers at free clinics in East Atlanta every weekend, treating patients who can't afford the luxury of health insurance. His daily routine is methodical and precise. He arrives early, stays late, and takes the cases nobody else wants. The comatose patients, the difficult families, the hopeless diagnoses that other doctors have already written off as lost causes. He finds purpose in the forgotten, strength in the overlooked, hope in the impossible. His apartment is sparse but immaculately clean, filled with medical journals and research papers he reads late into the night. The only personal touches are a single photograph of his grandmother and a small wooden cross that hangs above his bed. Marcus's colleagues don't know that he sends half his paycheck to his church in East Atlanta, that he's quietly paying for the medical school education of 3 other young men from his neighborhood, or that he's been working on a research paper about consciousness in comatose patients that could revolutionize the field of neurology. They see only what they expect to see, a quiet black man who keeps his head down, speaks only when spoken to, and carries the weight of being the only person who looks like him in a department run by old money and older prejudices. Today feels different, though he can't explain why. As he reviews his patient charts in the break room, something in his chest tightens with anticipation. Room 312 houses his most challenging case. Catherine Vanderberg, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune, comatose for 18 months after a riding accident. The family has given up hope. The other doctors have written her off as a lost cause. But Marcus senses something they don't. Something that keeps him coming back to that room day after day. Something that whispers to him in the quiet moments when the machines are the only sound in the darkness. The silver chain around Marcus's neck holds more than just his grandmother's photograph. Hidden beneath the image is that newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and creased from countless foldings, showing a young black boy receiving a full scholarship to study medicine. But what Marcus has never told anyone is that he met Catherine Vanderburg before, 15 years ago, in the marble foyer of the Vanderburg mansion during the scholarship ceremony. Marcus was 17 then, overwhelmed by the crystal chandeliers and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors that lined the walls like sentinels guarding the family's wealth. He had stood in that foyer in his best suit, a navy blue polyester creation his grandmother had bought at Men's Warehouse and altered to fit perfectly. His hands had shaken as he clutched the scholarship letter, still unable to believe that someone like him had been chosen for such an opportunity. Catherine Vanderburg had been in her 40s then, elegant and poised in a way that Marcus had only seen in movies. But when Catherine approached him, she had done something unexpected. She had looked him directly in the eyes, her voice warm and genuine, her expression bright with something Marcus had never seen before, from someone of her social standing, genuine respect. "You're going to change the world, Marcus," Catherine had said, her hand firm on his shoulder. "I can see it in your eyes. You have the gift of healing, and more importantly, you have the heart for it." Catherine had pressed a small card into his hand with her private phone number written in elegant script. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me," she had said. "I don't give out my personal number to everyone, but I have a feeling about you. You're going to do great things, and when you do, I want to be able to say I knew you when." But Marcus never called. Pride, perhaps, or the fear of being seen as charity. He wanted to prove he belonged on his own merit, not because of anyone's pity or misguided sense of obligation. He threw himself into his studies, working triple shifts at the hospital cafeteria to pay for textbooks and living expenses. He lived on ramen noodles and determination, studying by candlelight when the electricity was cut off, walking to class when he couldn't afford bus fare. He graduated at the top of his class, completed his residency with honors, and never once reached out to the woman who had made it all possible. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now worked at the very hospital where Catherine lay unconscious, surrounded by machines and the quiet desperation of a family preparing for the inevitable. Marcus's grandmother had died the year before, just after Marcus started his residency. She never got to see her grandson become a doctor, never got to witness the moment Marcus walked across the stage in his cap and gown, never got to hold the diploma that represented everything they had worked for together. The regret ate at Marcus daily, a constant ache in his chest that no amount of medical knowledge could heal. The last conversation he'd had with his grandmother haunted him. The old woman had been in the hospital then, her body finally succumbing to the diabetes and high blood pressure that had stalked her for decades. "Baby, don't forget where you came from," she had whispered from her hospital bed, her voice barely audible above the beeping monitors. "And don't forget who helped you get where you're going." Pride can be a poison if you let it fester too long. Now, as Marcus stood outside Catherine's room every morning, he wondered if he had let pride poison his chance to say thank you to the woman who had changed his life. Catherine lay there, surrounded by machines, her once vibrant personality reduced to beeping monitors and IV drips. The family had grown tired of hoping. The staff had grown tired of trying. But Marcus couldn't give up. Not on Catherine. Not on the woman who had believed in him when no one else would. The humiliation began subtly, as it always does in places where power wears the mask of politeness and discrimination hides behind medical terminology. Dr. Harrison Webb, the ICU department head, had made his feelings about Marcus clear from his first day. During morning rounds, he would consistently skip over his input, his steel blue eyes sliding past him as if he were invisible. When he presented his observations about Catherine's case, Webb would sigh dramatically and redirect the conversation to what he called more pressing matters. "Dr. Thompson," he said during one particularly brutal staff meeting, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that comes from decades of unchallenged authority. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm for this case, we need to focus our resources on patients who actually have a chance of recovery. Mrs. Vanderberg's condition is terminal. Her family has accepted this reality. Perhaps it's time you did as well." The other residents exchanged glances across the conference table, their expressions a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Marcus felt the familiar burn of shame creeping up his neck, but he kept his voice steady and professional. "Sir, I've been reviewing her latest brain scans, and I believe there are indicators that suggest minimal consciousness. Her neural activity patterns show." "Indicators?" Dr. Webb's laugh was sharp and cruel, cutting through the sterile air of the conference room like a scalpel. "Dr. Thompson, with all due respect, reading tea leaves isn't medicine. This is a research hospital, not a prayer circle. We deal in facts here, not wishful thinking." The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus's hands trembled as he closed his file, the sound echoing in the sterile conference room like a coffin lid slamming shut. He had presented solid medical evidence, documented improvements in Catherine's neural activity, measurable responses to new treatment protocols he had researched in obscure medical journals. But Dr. Webb had dismissed his findings as the desperate fantasies of someone who didn't understand the difference between hope and medical reality. The nurses were more direct in their cruelty, their comments sharp with the kind of casual racism that has learned to disguise itself as professional concern. Jenny Morrison, the head ICU nurse with 20 years of experience and a reputation for running a tight ship, had very specific ideas about who belonged in her unit. Marcus overheard her in the break room, her voice sharp with disdain and loud enough to ensure Marcus would hear every word. "I don't know why they keep assigning the hopeless cases to that boy," Jenny said, stirring her coffee with unnecessary force. "He spends more time in that room than he does with patients who might actually benefit from medical care. It's like he thinks he's some kind of miracle worker, like he's got some special connection to the comatose. Maybe he thinks praying over them will wake them up." Another nurse giggled, her laughter cruel and cutting. "You know how they are about that church stuff. All that laying on of hands nonsense." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his coffee growing cold in his hands as the words hit him like physical blows. The casual racism was nothing new, but it never stopped hurting. He wanted to confront them, to demand an explanation, to fight back against the ignorance and hatred that seemed to follow him everywhere. Instead, he turned and walked away, his grandmother's voice echoing in his mind. "Pick your battles, son. Some fights aren't worth your dignity." The Vanderberg family's treatment of Marcus was perhaps the most painful because it was so completely dismissive. They weren't overtly hostile, just utterly indifferent to his presence. Catherine's son, James, a pharmaceutical executive in his 50s with silver hair and cold eyes, barely acknowledged Marcus's existence during family meetings. Her daughter, Patricia, a senator's wife with political ambitions and a smile that never reached her eyes, would speak over Marcus as if he weren't there, directing all questions to Dr. Webb or the other attending physicians. During one particularly difficult family conference, Marcus had prepared a detailed presentation about Catherine's improving brain activity. He had charts, graphs, documented evidence of neural improvement that he had spent weeks compiling. He had practiced in the mirror, preparing for every possible question, every potential objection. But when he began to speak, James Vanderberg cut him off with a wave of his manicured hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "But I'd prefer to hear from the actual doctor in charge of my mother's case. No offense, but we need to hear from someone with more experience in these matters." "Sir, I am the doctor in charge of your mother's treatment, and I've been—" "Dr. Webb," James continued, ignoring Marcus entirely as if he hadn't spoken, "can you please explain to us what the real medical professionals think about my mother's condition? We need to make some difficult decisions, and we need to hear from someone we can trust." Marcus felt something die inside his chest. A small flame of hope that had been keeping him going suddenly extinguished. He had spent 18 months caring for Catherine, studying her case, researching experimental treatments that might offer hope where others saw only despair. He had sat by Catherine's bedside during the long nights when the family was nowhere to be found, holding her hand and talking to her as if she could hear every word. The local media had picked up the story of the comatose heiress, and Marcus found himself the subject of unwanted attention that felt like exposure under harsh lights. A gossip blogger had somehow obtained information about his background, his scholarship, his connection to the Vanderburg Foundation. The article was titled, "Charity Case Doctor Refuses to Let Go," and it painted Marcus as a delusional man who was prolonging a family's suffering for his own misguided sense of gratitude. The article went viral within hours, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The comment section became a cesspool of racism and hatred that made Marcus physically sick to read. Strangers questioned his qualifications, his intelligence, his right to practice medicine. They called him names that made him want to crawl under his bed and never come out, suggested he was keeping Catherine alive for publicity, accused him of being a diversity hire who was playing God with a white woman's life. Marcus stopped checking his phone. He avoided the break room, the cafeteria, anywhere his colleagues might gather to whisper about the latest scandal. He felt like a ghost haunting the hospital halls, present but not acknowledged, working but not valued, caring but not trusted. The weight of their collective dismissal pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember why he had wanted to become a doctor in the first place. Marcus sat in his Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled in the pre-dawn darkness. In his lap, he held a resignation letter he had typed and printed that morning, the paper heavy with the weight of surrender. The words blurred through his tears as he read them again. "I hereby tender my resignation from my position as resident physician in the intensive care unit, effective immediately." The final straw had come the day before. Dr. Webb had called him into his office, his face wearing that practiced expression of concern that barely masked his irritation and impatience. The Vanderburg family had filed a formal complaint about his inappropriate emotional attachment to Catherine's case. They wanted him removed from their mother's care immediately, and they had specifically requested that a more experienced and qualified doctor take over all medical decisions. "Dr. Thompson," Webb had said, his voice carefully measured and clinical, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your future here at Piedmont Mercy. Your emotional investment in this particular case has become what I can only describe as a professional liability. The family has completely lost confidence in your medical judgment, and frankly, so have I." Marcus had sat there in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, his hands folded in his lap like a schoolchild being scolded, as Webb outlined a transitional plan that would gradually reduce his responsibilities until he could find a more suitable position elsewhere. The message was crystal clear: resign voluntarily, or be forced out in disgrace. He had walked to Catherine's room one last time, standing in the doorway as the evening shift nurse checked the monitors with mechanical efficiency. Catherine lay there, peaceful in her unconsciousness, unaware of the battle being fought over her life, unaware that the one person who believed in her recovery was about to abandon her to the indifference of those who saw her only as a lost cause. Marcus touched the chain at his throat, feeling the newspaper clipping beneath his grandmother's photograph. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the sleeping woman, his voice breaking on the words. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I couldn't be strong enough to fight for you when everyone else gave up." The drive home had been a blur of tears and traffic lights, the city passing by in a haze of failure and defeat. Marcus's small apartment felt like a tomb when he finally arrived, the silence oppressive and complete. He had sat at his kitchen table, staring at the resignation letter, trying to find the courage to sign away everything he had worked for, everything his grandmother had sacrificed for. But as he reached for the pen, his eyes fell on the framed photograph of his grandmother in her nurse's uniform, standing proud and dignified despite the segregation and discrimination she had faced every day of her working life. The old woman's eyes seemed to look right through him, carrying all the strength and dignity of someone who had fought these same battles 50 years ago and had never given up. "Your hands were made to heal," he could hear his grandmother's voice whisper in the stillness. "Don't let nobody tell you different. Have I?" Maya had sat there in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolchild being scolded. as Webb outlined a transitional plan that would gradually reduce her responsibilities until she could find a more suitable position elsewhere. The message was crystal clear: resign voluntarily or be forced out in disgrace. She had walked to Catherine's room one last time, standing in the doorway as the evening shift nurse checked the monitors with mechanical efficiency. Catherine lay there, peaceful in her unconsciousness, unaware of the battle being fought over her life, unaware that the one person who believed in her recovery was about to abandon her to the indifference of those who saw her only as a lost cause. Maya touched the locket at her throat, feeling the newspaper clipping beneath her grandmother's photograph. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the sleeping woman, her voice breaking on the words. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I couldn't be strong enough to fight for you when everyone else gave up." The drive home had been a blur of tears and traffic lights, the city passing by in a haze of failure and defeat. Maya's small apartment felt like a tomb when she finally arrived, the silence oppressive and complete. She had sat at her kitchen table, staring at the resignation letter, trying to find the courage to sign away everything she had worked for, everything her grandmother had sacrificed for. But as she reached for the pen, her eyes fell on the framed photograph of her grandmother in her nurse's uniform, standing proud and dignified despite the segregation and discrimination she had faced every day of her working life. The old woman's eyes seemed to look right through her, carrying all the strength and dignity of someone who had fought these same battles 50 years ago and had never given up. "Your hands were made to heal," she could hear her grandmother's voice whisper in the stillness. "Don't let nobody tell you different." Marcus arrived at the hospital at 4 in the morning, 2 hours before his shift officially began, his car the only vehicle in the staff parking lot. He had spent the entire night reading, researching, preparing for what he knew would be his last attempt to reach Catherine. He had a theory, wild and desperate and probably impossible, but the evidence was all there in the medical journals if you knew how to read between the lines. He slipped into Catherine's room quietly, the early morning darkness broken only by the soft glow of the monitoring equipment. Catherine looked peaceful, her breathing steady through the ventilator, her color better than it had been in weeks. Marcus pulled up a chair next to the bed and began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper in the sacred quiet of the room. "Catherine, I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know that I'm not going to give up on you. Everyone thinks I'm crazy, and maybe I am. But I've been studying your case for months, and I think I know what's happening to you. I think you're trapped in there, aware but unable to respond." Marcus pulled out a small device from his pocket, a simple pen light he had modified with a specific frequency of light therapy he had read about in an experimental neurology journal from Sweden. The treatment was controversial, unproven, something that would never be approved by the hospital's ethics committee or insurance companies. But Marcus had nothing left to lose. "I'm going to try something," he said, gently lifting Catherine's eyelid with the practiced care of someone who had performed this examination countless times. "If I'm right, this specific wavelength of light might stimulate the damaged neural pathways in your visual cortex. It's a long shot, but I've seen stranger things work." He began the treatment, moving the light in precise patterns across Catherine's closed eyes, following the protocol he had memorized from the research paper. 10 minutes of exposure, then a rest period. 10 minutes more, then another rest. The pattern was hypnotic, almost meditative, and Marcus found himself praying for the first time since his grandmother's funeral. He had been performing the treatment for nearly 30 minutes when he noticed something that made his heart stop. Catherine's fingers had moved. Not much, just a slight flexing of the index finger on her right hand. But Marcus had been watching those hands for months. He knew every involuntary twitch, every random movement caused by electrical impulses in dying nerves. This was different. This was purposeful. "Catherine," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking with excitement and terror, "can you hear me? If you can understand what I'm saying, move your finger again." The response was immediate and unmistakable. Catherine's index finger moved twice, deliberately and with obvious intent. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he watched Catherine's eyes flutter open for the first time in 18 months. They were unfocused at first, confused and disoriented, but then they found Marcus's face and locked onto his gaze with an intensity that was startling. Catherine's lips moved, but no sound came out around the ventilator tube. Marcus leaned closer, his ear inches from Catherine's mouth, and heard the faintest whisper. "Marcus, I've been waiting for you." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, impossible and yet undeniably real. "You've been conscious?" he asked, his medical training warring with the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "But how?" "Your brain activity, the scans, everything indicated." "I know what's been happening," Catherine continued, her voice growing slightly stronger as she fought against the ventilator. "I've heard everything. The meetings, the plans, the discussions about pulling the plug. My family thinks I don't know, but I know everything. I've been trapped in here, aware but unable to respond, listening to them plan my death." Marcus's hands shook as he quickly checked Catherine's vitals, her pupils, her reflexes. Everything was improving rapidly, as if Catherine's body was finally catching up to her mind. But the implications of what Catherine was saying were staggering and terrifying. "If you've been conscious all this time," Marcus said, his voice barely steady, "why didn't you respond to the other doctors? Why didn't you show any signs of awareness during their examinations?" Catherine's eyes flashed with something Marcus had never seen before in a patient's face: cold, calculated anger. "Because I was waiting for someone I could trust," she said, her voice growing stronger by the minute. "Someone who wouldn't give up on me. Someone who would listen to what I have to say. I've been gathering evidence, Marcus. In my mind, I've been documenting everything. Every conversation, every decision, every moment when they thought I couldn't hear them planning to let me die." The full weight of the situation crashed over Marcus like a tidal wave. Catherine hadn't just awakened from her coma. She had been conscious and aware for months, possibly longer. She had been listening, planning, waiting for the right moment and the right person to reveal herself to. "There's something else," Catherine whispered, her eyes intense and focused. "Something I need you to know about who I really am, about why I chose you for that scholarship 15 years ago. I didn't pick you at random, Marcus. I've been watching your career, following your progress, waiting for the right moment to bring you into my world." Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet as Catherine continued speaking, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm not just Catherine Vanderberg, pharmaceutical heiress. I'm Catherine Vanderberg, the woman who has been secretly funding research into consciousness and coma recovery for the past 20 years. I'm the woman who has been waiting for a doctor brilliant enough and brave enough to prove that consciousness exists even when we can't detect it." The revelation hit Marcus like lightning. Catherine hadn't just been a patient. She had been testing the entire medical establishment, waiting to see who would believe in the impossible, who would fight for a patient everyone else had given up on. And Marcus had been the one to pass the test. "You mean you've been conscious this entire time, documenting everything, waiting for me to find a way to reach you?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. Catherine smiled, and it was the most beautiful sight Marcus had ever seen. "I've been waiting for you to prove that miracles are just science we don't understand yet. And you did it, Marcus. You reached me when no one else could. You believed in me when everyone else had given up hope." 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the marble foyer of the Vanderberg mansion. But this time, he wasn't the overwhelmed 17-year-old scholarship recipient. He was Dr. Marcus Thompson, the man who had revolutionized the understanding of consciousness in comatose patients and exposed a family's conspiracy to commit what could only be described as murder. The recording device Catherine had hidden in her bedside table had captured months of conversations between James and Patricia Vanderberg, discussions about hastening their mother's death, casual dismissals of Marcus's medical expertise, and cold calculations about inheritance and life insurance payouts. The criminal charges against Catherine's children were front-page news across the country. The medical board had launched a full investigation into Dr. Webb's handling of the case. Piedmont Mercy Hospital had offered Marcus a promotion to head the new Coma Recovery Research Division, funded by a $50 million grant from the Vanderberg Foundation. Justice had been served, but Marcus felt no satisfaction in their downfall. He had learned something profound about the nature of healing during those dark months. It wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about refusing to give up on the human spirit, even when everyone else had abandoned hope. Catherine, now fully recovered and more vibrant than ever, stood beside him in the grand entrance hall. She had asked Marcus to come, not for celebration or recognition, but for a different kind of ceremony. In her hands, she held a scholarship check made out to Darius Williams, a 17-year-old boy from East Atlanta who wanted to be a doctor just like Marcus. "You taught me something I thought I already knew," Catherine said, her voice strong and clear in the echoing foyer. "You taught me that healing isn't just about medicine or technology or even scientific breakthroughs. It's about refusing to give up on someone when everyone else has written them off. It's about fighting for those who can't fight for themselves, even when the odds seem impossible." Marcus watched as young Darius's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and disbelief, just as his had 20 years ago in this very room. The boy clutched the scholarship letter with trembling hands, his future suddenly bright, with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The cycle was beginning again, but this time, Marcus understood his role in it. "I want you to remember something," Marcus said, his hand resting firmly on Darius's shoulder. "When people tell you that you don't belong, when they dismiss your dreams as impossible, when they try to make you small because of who you are or where you come from, remember that kindness is not weakness. Remember that some battles are won not with power or politics or publicity, but with dignity and determination, and the simple refusal to give up." As they walked toward the future, Marcus touched the chain at his throat one last time. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice whispering in the wind that rustled through the mansion's oak trees. "Your hands were made to heal, son. Don't let nobody tell you different." The story had ended not with vengeance or public humiliation, but with the quiet triumph of a man who had chosen grace over revenge, healing over hatred, hope over despair. Catherine had returned to her role as a secret philanthropist, funding research and scholarships while her children faced the consequences of their greed. Marcus had accepted the promotion but insisted on continuing his work with comatose patients, knowing that somewhere in the darkness of unconsciousness, other souls might be waiting for someone to believe in the impossible. If you were him, faced with the choice between revenge and redemption, between public vindication and private grace, would you have chosen differently? In today's world, where justice often seems impossible and hope feels like a luxury we can't afford, have you ever witnessed such quiet triumph over injustice?